GPT going on right now. Where
parallel arguments to GPT.
Well, parallel arguments about writing that apply to ChatGPT too, right? Like artificial memory happening with writing, and seeing a similar kind of problem that Gadamer's highlighting, and then Socrates and Plato are highlighting. But I don't want to push for that as the first topic or anything.
Okay, that's great. I didn't see that coming, but now I see where you're coming from. So we'll be sure to get that on there. I've noted it. Chat GPT. We'll get there. And writing, that is sort of the main theme, is writing, right? Sorry to interrupt your lunch, Eric. Did I schedule this at a bad time for you? Eddie, you're here. Welcome.
Yep. Thank you, everyone. I'd like to go over the memory part, the part where he talked about memory and writing and orality. That seems to be something pretty interesting and worth noting for. Yep.
Great, let's turn to it. Now, memory gets mentioned throughout. Was there someplace specifically where you said this paragraph, this is where I want us to look, or these couple paragraphs, or this page? $186, perhaps, Eric is suggesting.
Yeah, I was initially looking at 188, but yeah, 186.
188. Sure, okay.
I was looking at the what is thematized here are temporality and the capacity to escape temporality. That was where I was looking for, but if we want to go to 186, we could.
Okay, great. This seems like the sort of thing where we're going to end up scrolling back and starting 2 pages earlier, because what's thematized here, but what he's referring to is the function of memory and writing. But that refers to the discussion in the Phaedrus about the limitations of writing. So that's a famous discussion in the Phaedrus where he talks about the invention of writing. We can look at it, and then moves forward in there and says, maybe writing isn't so bad after all. Maybe writing has actually a positive function and connects to temporality. So I'm throwing it back to you, Eddie. Would you like to go back a couple pages, or you want to start right where you've suggested?
We can go back to 186 and start from the beginning.
Start from the beginning, very beginning. Nancy, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I was just wondering, I mean, that whole argument around, the drawbacks of writing, that came in lots of ways. I think that, I mean, in my read of that Plato was sort of doing that in deference to his teacher, who was illiterate. And so, so to offer that it's a weakening of memory, I think was more of like kind of a bow to Socrates' inability to write.
So in the Phaedo, he is writing poems on his deathbed. So he might not, so there's some question about whether he's actually illiterate, but certainly the focus for him is on speech, right? And conversation and dialogue, and not on writing. It certainly seems like it emphasizes what was important to Socrates, right? Was conversation and dialogue. Let's look at 186, where this section starts. And Eddie, I think this is going to lead into what you're most interested in.
Or is it maybe technically 185?
Was it back one more even? We are going back to the beginning, one page. Where are you thinking, Eric?
The first mention is technically on 185, right when he quotes the Philebus basically in the middle of the page of 185.
Oh, there I see.
And it's right after the discussion of repetition, right? All the repetition, but then
right within epics.
Yeah, you got it right in the middle there where it's.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, he had just been talking about the ways in which the oral tradition works, and they found that that there's a tremendous amount of repetition in the Iliad, in the Odyssey, and other these great epics, which makes them easier to recite, right? They're like refrains. You can take a little mental break and get into the little, and now we do the same thing we say every time somebody is killed and do the thing and then get back to the story. So it provides a kind of rhythm and also a memory aid by having that fixed. And I think that's part of the idea, right? We fix things, in a sense, make them somewhat permanent. And in doing so, we enable our memory to make it easier for us to remember. So he says, this is on 185. He says, here we are very far from anything pertaining to the dimension of writing. That's from looking here. Nonetheless, ensuring the identity of the formula or of the phrase is a crucial element in such an event of oral repetition. The event is by itself capable of being fixed and is indeed impelled towards such fixing. That's a theme that he mentions regularly, right? That there's an inner drive to language to be fixed, to be written down, to be made permanent, to be made stable, to have a certain sort of life that extends beyond just the immediate moment of it. There's no question that the identity of such reoccurring formulas is more original than the identity of written signs. So the oral part precedes written language. Already in the way the epic uses language, reoccurring formulas constitute a stylistic element as peculiar as the one with which we are all familiar with from the use of writing. So it's familiar to us from writing that this is also going on in epics. I'm thinking about, like in Genesis, you have that, right? We know that there are certain sections of Genesis that we think were the priestly sections because they have a certain sort of repetition because they were part of, proto services or something like this. Already a way of epic. Okay, song and epic narration are indeed really like a kind of written recording in memory. Here's the line. This is how Plato describes it in the Philebus. It is memory. Here you go, Eddie. It is memory which inscribes the logoi in our soul. Right? The memory, the repetition, the fact it happens over and over again is what allows it to sort of take hold in us. Kind of like learning things, like what are mnemonic devices, right? That we use to help learn things better, right? Our song lyric takes hold in our soul and we can't get rid of it. The talk of the engram, I'm not sure what this references to. The talk of the engram, which is a well-known metaphor in modern psychology and neurophysiology, expresses this connection in a similar way. Does anyone have an idea about 1980s psychology and what he's referring to with the engram? Okay. Does someone else want to take over reading for a second here? We can take turns at least, and we're just going to go through line by line.
Well, I was going to ask Eddie, like, is there a question, like you brought up that you wanted to talk about memory? What about memory, and does that passage start to get at what you were raising?
I guess when I was thinking, when I was reading that passage, I was thinking of the Chinese poems I've read when I was young, because supposedly they can be sang as how we would sing the Psalms and the biblical Christian songs in the West. So that was what initially triggered my thought when he said it is the recurring formulas that are more original than the identity of written signs. So the whole meaning of poetry, literature, folklores even are perhaps passed down in a, not just in terms of voice and words, but in terms of rhythm, in terms of notes, in terms of singing, not just in terms of speaking.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think it's part of Gadamer's argument. Oh yeah, John, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that it may go beyond just the mnemonic device because, but I want to just make sure there's one thing that I don't know if everybody knows about this, but you know, in Parmenides' poem, there's a goddess at the beginning, and Gadamer says, he says, for my part, I believe I know quite well who the goddess is who speaks to the thinker. It is Mnemosyne, the goddess of Neme. Knowledge is based on the unifying power and the carrying ability of memory. Knowledge is a making available of experiences which accumulate more and more and awaken the question of meaning. All of this has for us. I won't go on, but this is from the beginning of philosophy. So memory, in a sense, for Gadamer, is essential for any kind of abstract thought. And so that's why one has to be delicate when one brings in writing, which actually the Greeks sort of in a way did invent in a way that was at the level we are today. This was the Greeks. And the best theory is that it came from writing down Homeric stuff. And I mean, there's been, 3000 BC there have been many, many, many systems. Most of the West Semitic systems of writing have all disappeared except for Hebrew, which is probably saved because of Christianity, but it's still not a level, rose to the level of Greek, and everything is sort of from Greek. Like they created a new sort of. At any rate, I just threw that in there. I'm getting lost here, but I think that memory is so important, and he doesn't want to. That's why it's writing. You have to remember that you can't use writing to displace memory. I think that's one of his points. It's a reminder.
Yeah, good. Yep, I that all makes sense. And he mentions that memory as being the mother of the muses, something like this. Of course, the muses are always appealed to as in the beginning of long poems to help the poet to carry through. And so memory is essential for any of that activity, I think.
And also memory is, when we die, we lose our memory, like we're in oblivion, supposedly from one, from one predominant theory. So memory is like an absolutely fundamental when it comes to knowledge or even consciousness. They didn't have a word for consciousness.
Okay, good. Well, let's keep going with this because I think this is really at the heart of some of the most exciting things in the reading. He says, if we look back on these initial considerations and reading again on 135, we can understand why there is a direct path leading from the repetitive form of the ritual to what we call literature. At the beginning of all recording, we have the legal document pertaining to the sacred or the profane, a kind of originary lore to which one can come back to at any time and which clarifies what the legal situation is. So his early writings were ways of establishing and settling legal codes and legal writings, writing down who owes what and who paid what to whom. And so we have a kind of permanence, a kind of record that can serve to either help our memory or replace our memory. We don't need to remember anymore because we've got it written down. He says, and this is the start of the connection to immortality, inscriptions on graves must have had a similar documentary character, which we find in all cultures. It serves the continued life of the dead in the memory of the living. The first step toward literature is obviously found in the place where memory, which continues to live on, is evoked in new and artful ways. That theme, some version of that sentence will show up a dozen times between here and the end about literature living on by being evoked in new and artful ways, right? It's always the renewal that allows it to live on, that gives it a continuing life. The invocation of the muses, with which the Homeric epics begins, is already such a kind. In particular, the poet's dedication to the muses at the beginning of Hesiod's Theogony is a kind of literary art form which presents the totality of what follows as a unitary book or work. And obviously, in all this, one must be conscious of the fact that such literature, even in its subsequent expansion into the different forms of lyric poetry, tragedy, or comedy, was not meant to be read, nor were, for that matter, the first forms of prose. They were meant for public recitation. So that's what I mean by read, just sort of quietly, right? These are things to be performed, to be read out loud, to be shared, to be spoken. This means that we are dealing here throughout with textbooks, with things set in writing, which are meant for reproduction and not for personal reading. This state of affairs may take different forms. Epic poetry has developed a distinct profession of rhapsody. Right? These are the performers of the epic poems. In many forms of lyric poetry, it may have initially been only the poet who recited the verses. By contrast, a choral lyric is already, in the literal sense, a textbook on the basis of which the public recitation is made. I think of these like scores that are performed. You know, they themselves aren't the text itself, it's in the performance of them that they come to life. The same goes for all forms of theater. That's the obvious connection. It may have been only in the case of early prose that the author was the sole speaker, at least in a first publication, if one can call it that. But even here, a repetition through renewed public reading seems likely. Thus, there is no strict separation between the dimensions of orality and writing, because writing itself served the function of orality. Transmission, tradition, Überlieferung, can be brought about in both ways, and in both cases, we have a new orality in which the transmission is first brought to fruition. So far, so good. Anything about that someone wants to bring up?
Well, I wonder if we, again, I'm going to jump back just to keep us in our background. At the bottom of the first page, on 183,
yeah,
he makes that reference to the posterior analytics at the end, you know, section 19, which is one he refers to throughout his work, which is the allusion to the sort of retreating army that sort of regroups.
right.
And he's saying that this is how concepts are formed. And that's memory as well.
I got here it is. I forgot to include the notes. I'll put it down there. There are the notes. But yeah, he's referring to this, it's the story of the army, right?
Yeah.
That just sort of builds and all of a sudden starts moving.
It's one line, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
There's no one point where he's like, okay, now and now we're stopping, right? It's sort of a dynamic process.
And at the very end of the posterior analytics, he says, now I'm going to tell you, Aristotle says, now I'm going to tell you how it really works. Like, I had all this logical stuff, but that's not how I do it. That's not my method. That's not how I operate, but here's how it really happens. And then he gives that sort of metaphor.
Yeah.
And Gadamer quotes that many times.
Right. It's a standard thing from
yeah. So anyway, I just thought we could keep that in mind too, because I think it's an encomium to philosophy. I think this little piece of writing is. Anyway.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good. And with that, we're sort of making a transition to the Phaedrus, is my sense of what's happening here, because in the Phaedrus, there is somebody with sort of the rhetorical speeches of a sophist ready to perform them. So at any rate, we see in the classical age of Greek philosophy how the art of prose was developed into a genuine literary genre. Speeches were even written down, and possibly not for the sake of preservation at all, but for the sake of being presented publicly in this form as literature. Or when they were real speeches, they underwent an artistic refinement and were thereupon also reproduced again and again as literature. Thus, we see in Plato's Phaedrus how the young admirer of Lysias carries with him a copy of a great rhetorical feat by the famous orator and is burning to read it out to Socrates. All right. So here we go. By invoking the Phaedrus, which is cropped up here, we're falling into a new field of problems. The Platonic dialogue Phaedrus stands powerfully in the way of taking for granted the transition from artful discourse to artful writing. From his dialectical analysis of genuine rhetoric, Socrates here draws conclusions which seem to lead to a radical critique of the dimension of writing altogether. As we see here, if the skillful anticipation of the addressee's reaction also belongs to true rhetorical art, writing becomes a problem. Plato expresses this through the story of the godlike inventor Thuth. How do you say it? Thuth, which Socrates narrates. He tells us how Thuth had we know the story. Maybe I can skip beyond this.
Why is writing weak? Why is there a weakness of writing?
Right. Well, we get this idea that writing is supposed to be helpful for memory, but Thuth was criticized by saying, no, it actually replaces memory. It makes memory weak. We don't need to memorize poems anymore because we can look them up. I don't have to memorize the dates of Plato's birth. I can look it up whenever I need to.
But there's this line toward the bottom of the page where discourses which are entrusted to writing are helplessly or hopelessly exposed to all sorts of misunderstanding and misuse. Like, I thought that was the weakness of writing. There's the weakening of memory, but then there's the weakness of writing itself that's not necessarily connected with memory, or maybe it is still.
No, I think you're right. I think this connects to what Nancy was saying about how Plato is pointing to Socrates' activity as being more philosophically relevant, because the next line is, when expressed in a lively exchange, speeches can be defended by the speakers themselves, explained, completed, or even improved, so that misunderstanding and misuse, if they arise, are quickly overcome. Right? When you're talking face to face with somebody, you can clarify things, you can realize where there's been a misunderstanding, you can rephrase it to fix it up. But we just have the text, there's all sorts of things that can be done with it, intentionally or unintentionally. I think that's
so it was looking like there's the appearance of knowledge in writing when it's not actually knowledge.
I think that Gadamer is going to say there is actual real positive function in writing, and that in this section Plato overstates it, his criticism of writing. I think that's where he goes later.
Yeah, I was thinking of the reason behind the reason of misunderstanding and misusing written forms of literature. And then what I thought of was synchronization. Because when he says, when expressed in a lively exchange, speeches can be defended by speakers themselves, explained, completed, blah, blah, blah. He was actually referring to the fact that when you have a bunch of people, including the author, around at the same time, it is very easy and straightforward and possible for a sort of direct feedback to be delivered and gained and expressed. But once you do it asynchronously, that is, when we're reading works thousands of years back in history, we don't have the authors there to around us to tell us what they mean, and perhaps we don't have experts or scholars around to decipher the real meaning of these texts. It seems bound that once the distance of time is elapsed, we would have to face the danger, the weakness of reading or deciphering text asynchronously.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in the end, that's sort of what Gadamer is going to say. We only are able to be talking about these things because Plato wrote them down. Right, the power of writing is things become fixed and established, and we don't have the same sort of opportunity to talk to Plato about it, but we're only reading this now because of Plato. As he says here, Gadamer says, does the rejection of the invention of writing and use of writing really follow from this, or is it rather an appeal to the right use of writing? something we call an expression of our time of a hermeneutic appeal. So he's going to say there's a function of writing that is not just about memory, that has a positive sense, rather than just something, just the negative sense you get in the Phaedrus. Jim Risser.
Yeah, I don't have my my picture today. I have to run in and out for several things. I just want to say, at that beginning of the second half of the Phaedrus, Plato is quite clear. He says, the question now is what makes a good speech, and that also means, or bad speech, and what makes good or bad writing. So he's asking the question of both speech and writing. And while, yes, he does privilege speech ultimately, it's interesting how he wants to make a case for good writing. I say this is very interesting because it's almost paradoxical relative to hermeneutics, because that good good speaking has to be written in the soul of the listener. So what a good written speech doesn't allow for is conversation and the movement of language and meaning and the movement to truth. And that's why it can be misused and hurried about. So my point about hermeneutics, because what relative to Eddie's remark, well, the whole question about reading is then for Gadamer becomes a matter of conversation. So it's still consistent with what Plato wants to say, even though he's criticizing writing at the same time. So you see, Plato has actually a complex position.
Yep, I hear what you're saying, Jim. That makes sense, because you want to say that engaging with the writing is itself a kind of conversation and a kind of dialogue. Is that
Precisely? Yep.
right? Good. Good. Eric.
Yeah, I think running with that section too, right, there's that part where, yes, we want to have love of true arguments, whether it's in spoken or written form, and how we go about getting to the truth of the argument, whether it's in spoken or written form, that we're going to need to engage it in a living dialectic or dialogue. But there's that paragraph where it's saying the seventh letter, right? The Plato's unwritten doctrine, where is there tension, right? To add to what Jim was saying about Plato's complexity, like there's this further layer that gets picked up by like Ibn Rushd and others, or even into, who was it? Strauss, right? Leo Strauss, that the esoteric doctrine of Plato that never gets written down, that there are certain truths that we cannot put in writing.
Yeah, that's a complicated question about what to make of the seventh letter. I mean, there's a whole world of scholarship about that, whether it's even authentic, right? But how to understand it. And Aristotle talks about the unwritten documents. He doesn't write them he doesn't think there's something that are beyond language. He just thought they were something Plato reserved for his inner circle. But then there is a question about whether there might be things
the inner circle that can only be done through dialogue.
Maybe
it can't be done through written word.
Yeah, I don't know that that's Aristotle's claim about it. I think Aristotle just claims he reserved this view about the one and indefinite dyad for those who are on the inside. But that might be another way to divide it. So there's certain things that can't be written. John Beach.
I was just going to say, I think that a couple of points. One is that all the essays in this book, in these volumes, I think were originally oral presentations by Gadamer, which he would then sort of edit and refine later. So that's something to recall. And then the second point was oh yes, Gadamer would say about the text, it has no meaning in itself. this, this sort of phantom that commentators have been chasing for thousands of years about what is the meaning of Plato or Aristotle's text. They'll never, it's not there in the text. It's there to remind those who know. It's in other words, it's there for those who can go to the place of philosophy where these texts came from, and it's to guide them, but it's not, cannot be captured within the text itself. But nevertheless, it still is valid. Like, I agree with Jim, like there's a he's not giving away, right, but Plato does talk about, in the seventh letter, he talks about the weakness of logoi, of arguments, and he also, especially Dionysus tried to put his unwritten stuff into language, and which is based on mathematics, actually, and as you said. So those are my two comments at this point.
Yep, thanks, John. Jim?
Yeah, to follow up on John, then, yes, the seventh letter, when John is right, what Plato is pointing to is that, look, if his philosophy was ever successful, why can't he just give it to someone and give to the people of the leader of Syracuse, and then he could just live justly and so be it. And that's what he's confessing to there. And really, he's talking about that it's a matter of everyone coming to an understanding about this matters, and it can't be simply formally presented. When he then talks about the weakness of the Logos, this is not, and this is no secret society or inside thing only for the elect few. He's saying that no matter, and this directly follows up on John's comment, the weakness of the Logos pertains to the fact that we only have partial insight, because every attempt to gain truth, the truth that reality itself, is always mediated. So every time you make a statement, it's a mediated condition of knowing. And this is what he's confessing to. This is the weakness of the Logos. The weakness is the weakness of all five, if you're familiar with that part. I wish Carlo was here, because I know he's also written on this. So you can't get to the truth. And so there's no just for the insiders about this, it's for everyone in trying to gain insight into what is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
Just to respond to those guys, John and Jim, like, I think part of, for me, there is that, yes, there's the mediation on the one hand relative to real reality or whatever, versus the tension between dialogue and writing, and what can get done with writing and what can get done with dialogue. And trying to expect from writing the same things we expect from dialogue is, I think, what I read Gadamer highlighting the seventh letter there in this paragraph, right? That it's not so much that he's concerned about whether there's this doctrine of real truth that's not mediated versus the relationship between writing and dialogue. And I think we said it earlier that the only way to get a true argument out of writing is to, at least for Gadamer, transform it into a dialogue with the text.
Can I make one last comment quickly? And why does Plato write dialogue form? I mean, if he's such an idiot to beat up on writing, why does Plato write at all? And the answer is, why does he write dialogue form and write the way he does?
Well, I don't think Gadamer's view is that actually writing is a failure. I think he thinks writing does things that orality can never do. And that captures something essential about us as human beings. And I think he would say Plato putting these things in writing is, I mean, we haven't really got to Gadamer's view yet, but I think it's gonna make sense why he put things in writing. And then why he wrote in dialogue form. Well, some dialogues are more in dialogue form than others, but I think we know about the ways in which we experience dialogue when we read dialogue and the way you sort of are drawn into it. And you can't just simply be a passive recipient of it. And I think so. I would say he wrote in dialogue form to inspire us to respond in dialogue and to engage in dialogue. Let me ask to Greg, did you have something on this?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to ask to the question of like what Gadamer himself thinks writing has over speaking, or what like the advantages of writing are. I mean, Gadamer says in a couple places that something to the effect that like the inner ideality of language is, you know, evidenced by the fact that it can be written down. So the fact that language can be written testifies to this fact about language in general, that it has this character that he calls ideality. And what I take that to mean is that it has the ability to kind of keep speaking, to keep saying something beyond the initial situation in which the utterance was made. So because words can be written down, that means that what I say right now, I could be said not just to you, but potentially to, you know, future people and different times and places. And so that ideality, the ability of meaning to break free from or detach itself, as Gadamer frequently says, from the one specific time and place when it was first uttered, that's what writing is all about. That's what writing does that we wouldn't have if like somehow language couldn't be written at all.
Yeah, great. That makes sense. I think that's what's going on here. Yeah, Tom?
Yeah, it's just a sort of passing observation, really. Oh, first of all, engram. Engram, I think, is the idea that when you remember something, it impresses upon some, you know, like Freud's mystic writing pad type idea. I think that's it, but I'm not a psychologist, but that's what I got from it. So there's a physical imprintation. Anyway, the passing observation, because then thinking about Freud's mystic writing pad, I was thinking about Derrida's work on that. And I'll be interested when we get onto sort of like Gadamer's you know, articulation of this, because it just seems to me that what Gadamer's, the path he's taking, he's ending up at essentially a very similar criticism to what Derrida has of the Phaedrus in Plato's Pharmacy, but he kind of goes there by a very different route and ends up with, you know, so Derrida talks about cure and poison, and Gadamer's talking about death and life in terms of writing. So they kind of end up roughly at the same place, but kind of facing slightly different ways. And it was just an observation. I mean, it's been quite a while since I read Plato's Pharmacy, but I don't know if anyone else felt that as well, or not.
Yeah, that's great. But maybe we should. I mean, maybe we should look at what Gadamer says, and then we can tease this out. I think the transition comes at the bottom of 189, and maybe we'll go back and talk about the symposium. But it's around 189 says, well, now we have to ask, is it not too radical to apply these insights to the questionable nature of all that is said in writing? Has Plato not left us with too one-sided of a position when he so totally secures himself from the decline inherent in the dogmatism of the dimension of writing that he unqualifiedly condemns all textuality? Does this not go too far? Are there not truthful texts which first satisfy the idea of the text and of the claim of literature precisely as texts, which are truthful texts by the fact that they are completely the same and impossibly unchangeable? Do we not call all poetic texts in the eminent sense texts? We have to ask whether Plato perhaps champions his own ideas all too one-sidedly when, in opposition to the sophistic style of misusing the logos for parading oneself, he puts the living transmission, the sowing of the logo in the soul. This truly has its own deep power to convince, and we will basically have to accept that the continued life of philosophical thought cannot consist in the transmission of reports around the doctrines of philosophers, as it became common in Greek cultural life since Theophrastus, I don't know, or it spreads itself today in the philosophical Alexandrianism of the age of positive science and Stoicism. That's a long sentence. Makes sense to say that philosophy does not have its permanence in text, but that text can only be aids to memory, and this means for those who know. And then he goes on talking about texts that have a certain status, a certain permanence, a certain validity for us, an eminence. And that, I mean, it sort of connects to what Greg said, that they have the ability to sort of live on. In fact, they have the ability to connect symposium to create a kind of immortality for us through the creation of these things. So I think that is closer to Socrates' view, that Plato is wrong to completely condemn writing over orality, and he doesn't appreciate how writing creates a kind of permanence, which he says from the start is inherent in the logoi, is trying to create this kind of permanence.
But why does he say that they are completely the same and impossibly unchangeable? What is it that's completely the same and impossibly unchangeable? It's not the book, because the book can decompose.
So here's how I understood it. Maybe someone else has a better understanding. But when I think about a poem as being unchangeable, I think that every word is appropriate for its place. And we can't say, well, this word would be better, because in doing so, we're actually talking now about a different poem. So that's what I think he means by that. But other people may have a better, but it is a pretty extreme view to say that they are completely the same and impossibly unchangeable poetic texts in this eminent sense. John Beach.
Yeah, just on that point, the way I understand that is Gadamer very decisively distinguishes between eminent texts and works of philosophy in this case. In other words, literature, poetry, and so on, where you do have that, the words, you cannot alter the words, like the words, that's it. Whereas that's not the way it is at all with philosophy in a sense, like they don't have that fixity that eminent texts do, such as poetry, which they're sort of they are their own truth. You can't go, it's not derivative from anything else. That's, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it fits what he says in the next paragraph. He talks about art. In next paragraph, 2/3 of the way down, he says, this is the true secret that is specific to art, it's on page 190, and to which there is nothing analogous either in the domain of truth proper to the sciences or to that proper of philosophy. So there you go, John, that's art versus science and philosophy. It goes hand in hand with the fact that works of art can be fully understood at a very different level of expression without the truth of what the artwork says lapsing into relativization due to this, and without false understanding misplacing its specific critical sense, which I think means that with works of art, we can continue to interpret them anew and find something new in them, and they can speak differently. And this isn't a refutation of other interpretations. The growing familiarity with a work of art not only does not exhaust it, but allows it as the same to become ever richer and to speak to us ever more vividly. Yeah.
And
That sounds like sort of what you were saying, right?
Yes. And Heidegger sort of was dragging this into philosophy, and especially into pre-Socratic philosophy and so on. And Gadamer wouldn't go along with that.
No, I think you're right. Greg Lynch.
Yeah, I think just to maybe make the same point in slightly different terms, I take it that Gadamer's claim here is that poetry is such that you can't paraphrase it without loss. And he talks about this elsewhere. This is why you can't translate poetry. So a work of philosophy right? Like if I'm trying to explain to you what Gadamer's saying in Truth and Method, I might say, well, if we were going to talk about this today, we might put it this way. And I use different terms, and those terms might actually be better, at least for the present context, to say what he was trying to say than the ones that are actually on the page. But his thought is that you can't do that with a poem. Yeah, if you paraphrase a poem, as you put it, David, you've written a new poem. And so that lack of, that inability to translate or paraphrase without loss is what he seems to think is unique to poetry or art or to text in the most eminent sense.
Yes, John.
Okay, excellent. And I would add to that, with philosophy, you must change it. It must be constantly changed in a sense. It must be, as he says at the very end of the Phaedrus, you have to cut it up and, and reconstitute it, or it's not really, you're not really a philosopher if you can't do that. And that's why the philosophical texts have no meaning in themselves. It doesn't remain fixed. And that's why the phantom, that object that classical scholars in universities are chasing, doesn't exist. And that's Gadamer's, it's not his, method of philology. It's just, he's talking about something quite different.
So is it the case then that what it means to keep a philosophical text alive is different from what it means to keep a poem alive? That with a philosophical text, to keep it alive is always to rephrase it, always find new ways to apply the meanings, always find new ways of talking about it, always find new insights in it.
Well, the third stage, hermeneutic application, that is when we use philosophy to question ourselves. That's when we put our own philosophical understanding at risk. That's encountering our own historicity and that's constantly going on in philosophical interpretation, as it were. You can never stop that. And,
right.
And that's why Gadamer says it's a reminder for those who know, like those who believe in philosophy and who are pursuing the truth of philosophy and so on, that must be constantly, because most people don't, like Derrida didn't believe in the truth that philosophy, there's any truth in philosophy, nor did Nietzsche, or so I mean, basically today neither do any university professors believe in it either. But if the Greeks did, well, they were all wrong anyway. But the so that's how I see Gadamer.
Yeah, good. Cynthia.
Well, this is similar, I think, David, to your question, and that is just about what Greg said. What then, for Gadamer, is the relationship between the translation of a poem and the poem?
Do you have an answer for us, or just put a
Maybe I'll
there?
ask it to Greg. He was.
Greg, this is to you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think he takes it that this is true in a sense with poetry, that it's not to other things, that what I'm doing when I translate a poem is trying to create a new thing as kind of close to the original thing as I can, whereas I'm not necessarily doing that with like a work of philosophy or something like that. That yeah, the translation is a new work. It's a new poem. Now it's right, obviously connected to that first one in a way that if I just wrote a poem completely from scratch, it wouldn't be. But it's just because he says, like in poetry, it's not even just like the meanings of the terms, right? The sound of the terms is kind of part of the gebilde of the poem itself, and you just can't carry that over without loss from one language to the next. So it's, I think there's a real sense for Gadamer in which you're missing something when you read a poem in translation that you're not necessarily missing when you read a good translation of work of philosophy or a work of history or something like that. But I don't know that I've got much more beyond that to say.
Cynthia, did you want to follow up?
Oh, I don't know. It makes me wonder then what's the relationship between sort of, 21st century performance of, Dvorak's symphony and, one of the 19th century or whatever. I mean, that would seem to make those be two so completely different pieces when I don't think they are. There seems to be a kind of relationship between them that's integral, and the same thing with the translation of a poem. Although, poetry has the additional complexity of words and so forth, but.
Yeah, I think he thinks that's different though. He seems to think that performing a play or performing a symphony is different from translating a poem. The analog to a poem would be like a reading of a poem, and every, outward, explicitly, vocalizable reading of a poem is going to be different from every other in the way that every performance of a symphony is. But he thinks translating a poem is a different sort of activity than that for some reason.
Would the analogy be rescoring a symphony for, say, a chamber group? Something like this, where you're going to say, okay, well, we're going to take the piece, but we don't have the horns to really do justice to it. So we're going to move some of these parts. Could that be the analogy? Or does that not work?
I would want to say it doesn't work because, I mean, I don't know. It seems to me that you can still identify it as the same piece. You hear it and you say, oh, it's the same piece, even though, the instrumentation is completely different, or it's being played in a different key, or, although some purists would want to say, no, it has to be exactly in the same key.
So you want to say that's still the same piece. But you don't want to say it's still the same poem, just in English rather than German, or you do want to say that? It's Greg who wants to say they're different poems.
I'm not sure what I want to say about poetry.
All right.
For the record, I want to say that that's what I think Gadamer is saying. I'm not.
All right, Greg.
I'm
Not
not 100% sure he's right about that.
All right, Eddie, you've been waiting.
Yeah, so then to respond to Greg, would Gadamer be satisfied with his, or would he prefer to be satisfied with simply sticking on with whatever we have with our new created poem from translation, despite all the losses from deciphering it? Or would he want to encourage us to purge on and perhaps venture through and hope that we can actually decipher the real essences or the real meanings with the least casualties possible, that is?
Greg?
I'm sorry, can you I'm not quite sure I got that. Can you rephrase that or just say it again? I'm sorry.
Yeah. So my question was that would Gadamer prefer us to be satisfied with whatever we have with the translated version, that is the version that's already a new work of art by itself, or would Gadamer want to encourage us to go on and try to work hard and decipher the original meaning of the original untranslated poem and see if we can actually get the essence or not?
I mean, so I think part of that would depend on what you mean by the essence of it, because I don't think Gadamer thinks that like a poem just has this like kind of fixed, unchanging meaning that's like kind of encoded in the original that like can't be encoded in a translation. I mean, even the original has to be interpreted, and the meaning is going to present itself in a different way each time. I mean, I do think Gadamer says there's at least going to be some benefit to right? If you can learn the language the poem was written in to reading it in the original as opposed to the translation. But yeah, I don't think he thinks that, yeah, there's this thing like the essential meaning that's like kind of encoded here, and if you've got the original, you've got that very thing. There's an identity with indifference in play all over the place here. He just seems to think that it's a different kind of identity in the case of these eminent texts. And again, I'm not 100% clear on what it is that's supposed to be special about that other kind of identity.
I think we should say that whether it's poems or philosophy or laws, that these are all legitimate examples for diathema of ways in which we aspire to immortality, right? It's not just by giving birth to children. They are a kind of children. He calls them, through these children, it's on 191, we achieve fame and immortality through memory, right? They are preserved not only as just dialogues, but Plato's dialogues, right? So Plato's memory lives on through the dialogues themselves. And then you get at the bottom of the paragraph of 199, exactly the play of same and difference that Greg refers to when Gadamer says, what we see here in substance points to the entire wide realm of the constantly renewed appropriation of this legacy of this. In this case, he's talking about Homer and Hesiod. These children themselves have been released into life and continue to live in memory, whether they have been set in writing or not. Their existence consists not in the adherence to the dead letter, but in the constantly renewed application and appropriation as the same and as ever different and new. So that's sort of at I think the heart of his view. John, do you want to get in here?
Yeah, just a quick one on this is a little bit of immortality and memory and poetry. And in 1976, I drove Gadamer to the airport because he was giving the North, like there were two Rilke conferences. It's the 50th anniversary of Rilke's death. And one was in Kansas City, where they had just recently acquired a pretty heavy archive of Rilke material. The other one was in Baden in Germany. Gadamer was giving the keynote address at both conferences because at that time he is considered as the eminent Rilke scholar that was alive at that time. And the one obviously in Kansas City, he delivered in English. So I don't think Gadamer would be like really dogmatic. I mean, it's you can't, poetries are, sort of sealed within their own sort of hermetically inside the language. But there, although it is true that you can't mess with the words in the sense. And the other thing is a little joke, if I may, which comments on our music, which thing is that I was playing in this jazz group once, and there was someone sitting at the front, and they kept requesting this same song over and over, and they were sort of, I think, demonstrating their knowledge to their friends that they were real aficionados or something. And then my friend, who is the leader of the group, just said, well, we won't play you that song, but we'll play you another one here, and it's got all the same notes in it. And Sylvia loves that.
Yeah, that's a good
one, eh, Sylvia? Yeah,
right.
so there's a little joke, a little whatever that means, I don't know, but
thanks, John.
okay.
There are things going on in the chat. Should we try to move some of these into the conversation? I mean, one of the issues that we've brought up that we really haven't dived into yet, but it's certainly on the table from the very start, is the way that technologies and writings of technology facilitate or replace memory. And some people who think we have extended minds think it's a mistake to think of our minds as being inner, as Gadamer says anyway, but our minds are in our phones and in all sorts of other devices that we use to preserve memory. And then the question is whether these devices are actually facilitating memory or weakening memory, replacing memory. I know this is something that Karen, you brought up in the chat talking about Google. Do you want to bring that to the full discussion?
We could. I actually thought what was later in the chat was a little more interesting. Like
Do that.
I
Whatever you like.
Just talking about on the same question, rather than sort of changing the topic, on the same question of like how adaptations and translations work, or arrangements of musical pieces, that kind of thing. You know, we were talking about what is it that, if it stays the same, what is it? And we were playing with the phrase from page 190. Gadamer says this tonal totality of meaning. And we were thinking about, okay, like what does that mean, the tonal totality of meaning? And what would it mean to preserve the tonal totality of meaning? And could that be done in an adaptation? That was the question that that I thought arose in the chat, that I am still thinking on, because I'm not sure what I think about that.
Yeah. Are there thoughts about that?
Just a question. Is tonality solely oral, or is tonality also inscribable?
Well, I think tonality is inscribable because you can hear the words. Does that make sense? So, I mean, the example I have in mind, I was reading a piece just earlier today, and it was a translator of the Hebrew Bible, and he was talking about the difficulty of translating because there's so many plays on words, and there's so much built into the word choices, so they sound alike. They're like a version of alliteration. And there are nonsense words built in there that are just sort of to play off things. And so he was trying to do a translation that preserves some of the rhythm and sounds of the original Hebrew. But those were written. I mean, the word, he was able to write the words out, and so you could see how they would sound alike together. In the same way, when you look at a poem, because you have a sense of what it would sound like, you can say, oh yeah, that's a very clever internal rhyme, or something like that. Does that make sense? So I think you can do it in the writing, but maybe you want to say, but that's just derivative of, because you know what it's going to sound like were you to speak it. I don't know. Tom, you want to get in here?
Just as you were saying that reminded me of a late night argument I had with another philosopher who, while I wasn't arguing, he just got very irate and threw his pint glass down and said the most heinous thing in the world today, and I said, right, and he said, is the willful mispronunciation of Latin. And then we got into a big argument about how you could know what Latin, and he made an argument very similar to that. Oh, it's about the poetry and all that kind of thing, which I wasn't convinced by. Anyway, that just made me think of it. I've probably forgotten my actual point now. I think, though, it's interesting. This tonality idea is really interesting, and as we were, people are talking, and I also thought the question about ChatGPT was really interesting, because there's almost an argument around the sort of creation of the artificial creation of writing, or machine learning writing, or whatever, that becomes so cliched that we don't want to go down that way. You don't want to say, oh, it's going to take over human minds and all this kind of stuff, because that misses the fact that when you read the stuff that ChatGPT does, there's clearly something missing. And for me, there's clearly an overstatement about how easy it is to get to be deceived by things. And I was thinking, well, maybe that tonality is, that tone or tonal totality is something, is that thing. Maybe what we're dealing with here is just something that is literally dead letters recycled from Google searches. And in that sense, what Gadamer is saying here is quite an interesting sort of angle that doesn't lead us back to the sort of standard, slightly technophobic arguments against ChatGPT, which are usually about 20 years behind. Well, they don't They don't notice how much machine learning has already been brought into the things that we do in everyday life. So yeah, I think that was the point I was going to raise.
Yeah, great, thanks. Makes sense. Greg?
I was just going to say, just to add another data point to help with Karen's question. So this but what was the phrase, unified tonal whole or something, or?
It was the tonal totality of meaning.
Yeah, so that's more or less the same kind of language that he's using when he describes what a Gebilde is, when he's like in part 1 of Truth and Method, like a structure. And the idea is supposed to be that the structure is kind of what makes an artwork the artwork that it is. And it's the thing that like artistic play has that non-artistic play doesn't have. It's the thing that allows artworks to be repeatable, whereas like, you know, Super Bowl 23 is not repeatable. And it's also the thing to which interpretations, he says, are answerable. So he says every interpretation has to hold itself accountable to the criterion of correctness that derives from the Gebilde. So the idea here is that, right, there is something that he calls a Gebilde that's kind of like what makes Hamlet Hamlet. And then to perform Hamlet, right, or understand Hamlet, you have to hold your interpretation accountable to that. And when he uses the word text in his kind of technical sense, he's usually using it in that same way. A text is just like a linguistic Gebilde. So that doesn't really answer your question, but maybe just gives a couple other data points to point to find an answer to it.
Okay, there we go. There we go. Okay, Jim Risser.
Yes, I hope I'm not in the middle of something, but to respond to Karen's comment and question. When Gadamer mentions tone, he's referring explicitly to Hölderlin, who spoke about the tone in poetry and describing from Greek tragedy, the overall tone, the enduring tone, is what holds it together against the counter rhythmic ruptures that occur in the tragic poem. Incidentally, some of this will be in my paper that I'm giving at the CHI meeting in another week or so. There's a plug for Nancy's conference. So he's referring to Hölderlin about if I say musical, you have to put that in quotation marks. It's rather the rhythmic character of art. And it's about the way in which there is a unity being held together with respect to its component parts. Now, that's explicitly what we call a text as well. A text is a unity. That's about a multiplicity of things going on in it. So Gadamer, when he wants to talk about the unity of meaning, he comes back to this word tone. If you look on page 184, when he uses the word rhythm, he says, I just lost the sentence. Yeah, it's on, if you have that page, it's in the first full paragraph, about 5 lines down. And he says, I would like to speak not of the unity of a sentence, of the sentence, but of the unity of the phrase. Now, I see Cynthia's here. So he's talking about the phrase in relation to music. But what he means is the phrase is that one unit, that first unit of measure, you might say. And so he's talking about how hermeneutics with respect to reading a written text is reading, this is my phrase, language without sentences. That is, we're always reading with respect to the formation of unity. that has then an encompassing character relative to a text that we could call an enduring whole or the unity of the text. One last comment about Gebilde. Well, you know, Denny Schmidt and others have all been talking about how translating Gebilde as structure can be slightly misleading, because a Gebilde is literally a formed image. So one can even talk about, and I'll just say this and stop because I'm really talking about something, maybe this is going to be my paper. Gebilde, you could translate as rhythm, because it's, in the sense of an enduring tone, it's holding together relative to a formation that continues to be in movement. That is, the text for Gadamer is not literally the physical thing. It's that that thing between, or that the reader's in contact with, that lends itself to a movement that is a reinterpretation. That is, it's still in a process, you might say, of movement relative to interpretation.
Great, thanks, Jim. And yes, you also go to Calgary in 10 days. If you weren't planning on it, get your flight, hear the whole talk. And hear Denny talking for 3 days as well. John Beach?
Yeah, I hope I'm not speaking too much, but yeah, I just, Jim's was talking about something really important, like Gadamer's talking about structure, and he goes on to add about, or mention something about grammatical expression continues to live on in a definitive way. But like in orality, even before you get to writing, like it's this sort of structure is already there, and it's more than just mnemonic devices, I think. And it's probably what's behind grammar too. But I would say that that phrase that Karen mentioned, what is it, the tonal totality of meaning, that wasn't possible until Greek, until they invented Greek. You can't have that it's impossible in Hebrew, right? Like you can take one Hebrew sentence and it can be translated 15 different ways. And this was all the West Semitic languages like this, and they've all been lost except for Hebrew. The Pentateuch, the Septuagint was a translation of the Pentateuch into Greek. It was done by Jews for Jews who couldn't read their own language. It was done so that the Jewish people could learn how to read the Bible, because Hebrew, the only people who could read it are those people, the priestly caste. Like it's all those ancient languages. It was a sort of a small limited people. Greek was the first, possibility of shall we say, what's the word, literacy. It was like literacy was not possible before Greek. And so I know it's a bit, I just thought I'd throw that in there, but that's what that expression says to me. Anyway, so.
Yeah, good. Right. Thanks, John. So should we, oh, go ahead, Eric.
Just to keep going with the tonal totality of meaning, right, we were focusing on the tonal part rather than the totality part. And so, right, if that's the it that is getting translated or paraphrased or interpreted or reinterpreted, the tonal totality of meaning, if I am translating a poem or a philosophical essay into another language and I'm highlighting, right, because I can't capture the whole, right, it's hard to even talk about it without having words like the whole or the totality, because you're leaving something out or you're highlighting and de-emphasizing other parts. So I still am kind of confused about the totality, the whole, right? That is the it that we're supposed to be using as our criteria, right? And Greg, I really appreciated what you were appealing to with truth and method earlier with the transformation into structure or whatever that he was using, right, as the kind of criteria for it. But when you gave the example of the Super Bowl, I was like, yeah, Super Bowl 23 can't happen again, but the Super Bowl happens again. The Super Bowl is repeatable. Like the game of basketball is repeatable. So to me, it does apply even in non-works of art.
Greg?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just to that last part, I think the Super Bowl is repeatable, but that's precisely because the Super Bowl is something like a festival, more than it is it's a festival that happens to also be a sporting event, but it's not just a sporting event. It's not just a game. So it's the Super Bowl qua Super Bowl has kind of already undergone the transformation into structure in that way. To the other point about why is this a total, you look quizzical about that. So did you have a?
Well, but games as such are repeatable, right? The game of solitaire, I can play again, even though it's not the exact same game.
Yeah, but it's not, but I think that's the difference. It's not this game, right? Whereas Hamlet is this play. Hamlet is a particular, and that particular can be repeated as the same particular, which is why we don't say, oh, I went to the theater today and saw a Hamlet. We say I went and saw Hamlet. So I think this is at least how Gadamer thinks about it, that you're not just when you perform a symphony or a play again, you're not just repeating the same kind of thing. You're repeating the same thing. It's the same.
But is that a matter of convention, or is that a matter of truth? This distinction between I'm going to see a Hamlet versus I'm seeing Hamlet.
Yeah, so he thinks it's a matter of substance and truth. And here's maybe to what I was originally going to say to your point there. I think part of what he thinks undergirds this distinction here is precisely that works of art or things that have a gebilde are totalities or they're wholes or something like that. And here's what I take that to mean. I take it that for something to be a whole is such that like the parts kind of mutually interpret one another. So if something happens in a play, we expect that to be meaningful relative to the other parts of the play. Like if something kind of out of the blue occurs in the middle of a play, that causes us to go back and kind of reevaluate this reveals a different kind of significance to what happened before. There's no ideally at least, there's no loose ends, there's no flukes in a work of art. We think that everything kind of hangs together such that you can interpret the whole in terms of the parts. But a mere game isn't like that, right? We don't think the parts of like a football game hang together as a whole in that way. We don't, right? If there's a fumble on the goal line in the third quarter, we don't think, oh, now I see what was really going on with that, that punt in the first quarter. We don't think that the parts mutually interpret one another that way. There are flukes in sports, and that's kind of why we like sports, because it makes them unpredictable. But I think that lack of flukiness is what he's getting at when he says that an artwork is a whole or is a gebilde.
But there are flukes, right? Like that's where flukes can actually be generative. Right? I'm thinking of the medieval Arab philosophers who thought that Plato's writings and Aristotle's writings were of the same person, and they put effort into synthesizing that philosophy. And although historically they were inaccurate in thinking that it was the same person, they still came up with really awesome metaphysics and epistemologies and things like that. So to me, flukes can be generative too. They're still, I'm trying to think of cases where, you know, like there's a typo in the publication of a book or something that leads to like a really interesting interpretation, but yet like the author might say that was a typo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, I think I agree that like there can be happy accidents and they can lead to positive things. But suppose like I published this new and groundbreaking interpretation of, I don't know, a Marilyn Robinson novel or something like that. And I'm making my whole case on this one sentence from the novel. And then you come to me and you're like, Greg, like, I hate to break this to you, but the copy of the book that you bought just has a misprint here. And she actually used a completely different word than the one that you're hinging your case on. The thing I came up with might be super cool and interesting. It might even be more interesting than the book itself, but it's a misinterpretation, right? It's not, the thing I've interpreted is not the book that was actually written. And I think that's what the point is. It's not that flukes can't be useful. It's that we don't, when we're treating something as a work of art, we go into it with the assumption that there are no flukes here, that everything that's here is here for a reason and it mutually informs everything else.
Let me give another example, which I think is close to what Gadamer is talking about. Maybe it's a more extreme example, but it's the same paragraph. So he's contrasting philosophical texts. He says they function to spark our thinking. That's their role, is to engage our memory and to ignite us in fruitful dialogue. And then he contrasts those with texts which possess their peculiar distinction in the inviolability of the letter, such as religious, legal, or poetic texts. So I thought, well, here's an extreme case. How about a contract, a legal contract? A legal contract is supposed to have, one could even think that in such texts, the true meaning of writing is really fulfilled as a codification of what is valid, as a preservation of what is valid against misuse, adaptation, distortion, or even denial. So a legal contract is supposed to sort of settle everything, make it all clear, leave nothing up for interpretation. Sort of, it's not a trigger to reflection. It says everything that needs to be said, and it's all right there. Which is similar to what Greg was saying about poems, right? They're all right there in front of us. And then he says later, what is at stake is the singularity of the structure put together in language, not only the letters, but the unity of sound and meaning. I'm not sure you need the unity of sound for a legal document. And then you get the totality of meaning, may be realized in ever so imperfect and multifaceted approximations. So we never actually have the pure meaning. We have approximations of it. But what's different about this, he says, but it is posited as if there were an unchanging standard against which any reproductive realization is measured. So we think, but nonetheless, there is the contract here, and we may understand it imperfectly, but it exists as an ideal object with a meaning waiting there to be discovered. In the same way, we might say the poem's meaning is not just simply whatever comes to you as you're inspired by it in the moment, but it's something that has a kind of permanence above and beyond all of our approximations. You know, it is what it is already right in front of us, and it's our job to try to get at it. Does that seem to be, but then does the contrast fit with philosophy? That philosophy doesn't have that kind of permanence, that philosophy is just a constant invitation to think anew and think in new ways and fruitful ways. I don't know that the contrast makes as much sense anymore, because I think of philosophy as being something more. I mean, years ago, I was running a philosophy discussion group at an MFA program, and they really didn't care what the philosopher said. They just want to know how it might inspire their artwork, right? They just want to know what they could do with it and where they could take the ideas and run with it. And I think it feels a little bit like that sort of contrast. The philosophical text is there to inspire dialogue rather than a poetic text, which has at least the presumption. What's the line here? At least it is posited as if there was an unchanging standard. So that's why I thought of a different example. The legal
just David, where exactly was that again? What page?
Page 190. It's the exact same paragraph you all were reading from.
Okay,
I
thank
was
you.
reading the sentences around where you were reading. I wanted to mention the last paragraph because Gadamer in his last, especially things where I'm not sure this is talk, things that were talks, he tends to go big in his last paragraph, and this is a very nice last paragraph. So I wanted to mention this, but then I wanted to make sure we get to the question of the role of technology in memory formation or preserving or memory replacement. Right. Does someone else want to read this though? I feel like I've been reading a lot and I love to sort of save my voice. If someone would like to volunteer to read.
I'll do it if no one else wants to. When Diotima or Diotima proceeds in this way, she is, however, no longer certain that Socrates can follow her. The path of love she describes leads through all the logoi in all their forms, which ought to be traversed, and it is supposed to engender logoi everywhere until it reaches the heights of a final insight into the beautiful itself. In this final vision, in the fulfillment of love, which is only contemplating and being with, Diotima recognizes for her part the life truly worth living. We have to ask ourselves what this conveys to Socrates and thus to us. Plato can hardly distance himself from the life of self-examination, which Socrates considers his own, and he will certainly not ascribe to himself a life of fulfilled vision. Does he not rather say this to himself and to us who can hardly all follow him on this path? What's the it that he's saying to himself? Does he not rather say this to himself? What's the this that he's saying to himself? That the life of self-examination is worth living, whereas the unexamined life is not worth living? Is that the this?
He will certainly not ascribe to himself a life of fulfilled vision.
Fulfilled. Okay, got it.
That philosophy is the recognition of the value of the life of pursuit,
right?
A life of having and arriving and being done with it.
Okay. Yet we know that in all the restless to and fro of presence and wakefulness, forgetfulness and sleep, which governs our every aspect of our temporal and finite being, the dialogue of the soul with itself continues and constantly renews itself so that there is something durable in the end, memory and recollection. In the dialogue on Eros, it is the beautiful itself. In the dialogue on the ideal city, it is the good itself towards which we are casting our gaze. The highest and unique is not only otherworldly, removed from all temporal decline, passing away in transience, it also has its existence in everything that is beautiful, everything that is good. Like the animal species has its existence only in all of its exemplars. What we learn here is that it is also true of the word, of the logos, that it only exists when it renews itself constantly. Indeed, this is even true of the dead letters of that which is written, that they reach their existence only when they are revived in the soul. I can't read that word.
That's me memory.
Mnemosyne.
Mnemosyne is the mother of all the muses.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Eric. I feel like that's a dramatic
Yeah.
ending. That's worth airing. John, did you want to comment on that or something else?
Yeah. I think we don't want to just think that philosophy is just dialogue. It does involve dialogue, but Plato, like what Plato means by dialectic, is more than it's just not like, like, well, we got something to sit around and talk about. This is what they do at Oxford, or they used to do that, just, but the thing is, there's truth. Like, what is the good? Like, how do we know? How do we guide our lives? How does society survive, if it is going to survive, which is not likely for very much longer? Like, philosophy has a role to play here. Truth has a role to play. So it's not just, so philosophy is not just, leading us to conversation topics. You know what I mean? So, like the good, to get to direct yourself to like all of even the practicality of all that's involved, and the application of having your vision on the good involves constantly questioning yourself and fighting back the blindness and so on. So I think that this is why, but you can never put this down in writing. Like, it can never be, like in the Phaedrus at the very end, he says, when he says that it exists only when it renews itself constantly. And he said, well, you can read a great speech from Lucius's great speech, but if you can't put it aside and reconstitute it and present it orally, you're not a philosopher. And this is what Gadamer lived by, this principle. He always, even when he did that thing on the historical transformation of reason, he was not reading from a text, as Jean Gondin thought. I was there. He wasn't. And he never did, because he believed that this was philosophy has to be rethought, and this is dialogue is at the basis of it, because in dialogue we're not in control totally. Like, something else takes over, something else emerges when we dialogue and listen to other people. And so I thought we don't want to lose what Gadamer is a philosopher. He is a philosopher. He's talking about philosophy, and this is why I say this is an encomium to philosophy. It's cannot be replaced by art, cannot be replaced by anything else. It still has its role.
Yeah, thanks, John. That's helpful.
Yeah, John, what was the word you just used? A blank of philosophy?
Oh, encomium. It's a Greek word. It just, they talk about Gorgias's encomium to Helen. It's just a praise. It's a speech of honoring. So it's to me, this is, when I read this, I thought this is an encomium to philosophy, not to poetry, not to art, not to any other kind of, but to actually philosophy. And just to add what I said before, we don't have any poetry before Homer. Why? Because there was no language invented that could express poetry. There was thousands of languages, but they all died except for Hebrew, because Christianity saved it. But it's none of these things could really have this, could express the full meaning of what was being spoken. Greek was the first. We've never gone beyond that stage.
Good. So Karen asks in the chat, hang on just a second. All right, I think it's past now. Karen asks the chat, is there something that the philosophical word and the poetic word share, that they need to be constantly renewed to exist or to live? Karen, do you want to say more about that? Or is that it? That's the question.
I guess that's sort of it. When I first read it, I thought he was still talking about literature, and then it seems on second thought when he's talking about the dialogue of the soul with itself, that seems to be more a reference to philosophy. So I was just sort of checking my understanding of the passage.
Yeah, great. What do people think? I think that's true. I think one of the points that's being made here is there are both ways. He says that it's part of human nature to try to escape our temporality, part of human nature to try to seek immortality. to try to overcome, to recognize our finitude by trying to overcome our finitude. And that's two ways in which we can try to do it. Through writing poetry, through writing philosophy, we're trying to create something that outlasts us, that's part of us. But that only survives, we only survive if that continues to be read and interpreted and brought to life, renewed repeatedly.
David, I guess that's where I'm still stuck on this same yet different stuff. Okay. And it connects, Karen, with what you're asking, because I don't have a response as much as I just am asking the question too, now that you've posed it. But is the saying of a philosophic or poetic word in an instance not the opposite of it living forever? Because the kind of it that transcends our finitude seems to not be the same thing as bringing it into this moment, to be able to say the poetic word or say the philosophic word in this moment that we have renewed or resuscitated or restored. He used a bunch of words at the end where he's like restore, right? All of this fighting against oblivion. But is it about the quest for immortality, or is it about the quest for this moment right now? The living word is happening. I didn't want to make a Christian allusion there. That was accidental. The word is actually happening between us, and that's our finitude, not that we keep trying to transcend to immortality, something that outlasts us, that's still the same, that continues to live on, right? That sort of stuff. Like, to me, is he reinterpreting the ancient idea of immortality into the now, well, for him, it was contemporary idea of finitude as this constant seeking. To me, the inverse of what you're kind of asking, Karen, is the question I had earlier, is that gods can't write poetry or do philosophy. Earlier in the essay, Gadamer says this, where he's like, yeah, none of the gods can do philosophy.
No, or he says they don't do philosophy, not they can't, but it would be useless for them. They don't need to do philosophy.
They wouldn't,
188, yeah, right.
Yeah, it's
well,
not.
In Truth and Method, he puts it this way. He says we could question whether an infinite mind could even recognize something beautiful. That's what, to me, it's an issue of can or can't, but I get what you're saying, John, that the technical wording is that they happen not to.
Well, the gods, yeah, they're not finite. They don't have, they're not burdened with human finitude. But because we'll always strive for the unity of reason, we have to but the gods have no need to do that.
But do gods even have words in the question that Karen's asking, right? Is something right? Is this something that the philosophical word and the poetic word share, back to the same thing? But can gods use philosophical and poetic words or words at all?
Well, not to the Greeks. The poets use the words. There's no words that come from the gods in Greek tradition. They didn't even have a word for religion. And so the idea is, the God is the word. That's Judaic, completely Judaic. That comes from the Greek. That was Luther that translated that as word. But
no, I'm not trying to get transcendent. Yeah. Zeus is depicted as talking.
Well, yeah. I mean, but this is, but Homer, Homer invented that, and the lyric, like in the Pirates, like all the poets have different ways, and the tragedians, and even before Homer, there would have been another way of talking about Zeus or the gods, and Hesiod does it another thing, but it's all creative, like it's all created by man to talk about something that's very real that they experience in their everyday life. it's the way they, there was no such thing. You didn't need to believe in gods. I mean, it was an everyday experience, but I'm maybe I'm going off the track here. I think.
Let me try taking us back to Karen's question. I think there's a way in which we say Plato lives on through his writings, but he only lives on through his writings to the extent that we actually read them, engage with them, or he lives on through his ideas, but the ideas only exist to the extent that they are taken up and brought to life again. And so I think that brings together both the idea of a kind of immortality of memory that allows you to live on past your death, and the idea that this only happens to the extent these things are renewed, and an appreciation for writing, for being able to do that in the ways that oral traditions can't do that, because it creates a kind of permanent record that has a certain physical presence that can go beyond the limitations, the temporal limitations of your body. Does that help tie some of those things together? Eric, you're saying it has to be one or the other, but I thought that that's the way it all fits together. We have this desire to part of what it means to be temporal is also to want to be more than temporal. And
yeah, I guess I was just trying to explore with Karen's question if that's a way to demythologize metaphysical immortality talk, right? Like, obviously there's no such thing as immortality. Let's stop talking about it as if there is such a thing. And then the other way to talk about it is to say that whatever it is that's renewed within the actual speaking of philosophic or poetic words.
Right. So yeah, so I think the Diotima doesn't talk about the soul. I mean, there's a Woody Allen joke, right, about how I want to achieve immortality not through my work, but through not dying. Right. That sort of thing, right? But she spoke specifically on the way you achieve immortality through children, if you're that kind of person, through fame, if you're a kind of fame-hungry person, through poetry, creating poetry, but it's always memory that does it. But Eddie, you've been waiting very patiently. Go ahead.
A response to Eric. This is actually something I've learned from Dr. Marshall. That's what he told me the other day. So since he's not here, I'll repeat what he said to me. In regards to the fact that the gods wouldn't do philosophy, his reason was that suppose when we talk about gods, they transcend time and space. They are beyond spatiality and temporality, to put it in a funny way. So then, if that's the case, then all words, all philosophy would have to be done in relation to some sort of time and space, in relation to some sort of place. At least it needs a place to happen for any philosophy to go on. But for gods, who are by nature transcendent of time and space, they don't need a discussion about about ontology, about what there exists, about what there is, about what's going on, because they are beyond time and space, which makes them beyond philosophy and words. That's not me, that's Dr. Marshall. So if anything you find...
I think the tension is between like people's philosophical theology and their notions of divine entities versus the gods that we actually see showing up in literature that actually talk with human beings and are in specific moments of time and space, right? Within a narrative. So if we're talking about metaphysical divinities, fine. But when we're talking about like this specific story of Brahman telling the Buddha to go do his teachings, right? That's Brahman at a specific point in time and space.
Yeah, but going from that reference, Vishnu in the Hinduist, he said to Arjuna that he's all but beyond all.
Yeah,
so
he says that
ability to be at a particular time and space, but also the ability to transcend and pull himself away from it, which is not something human beings can do. I guess that's what Dr. Marshall was saying. Yeah. So if that's a decent, plausible response,
Always helps. Sort of a proxy for Don. Yeah, John.
one little point to pick up on, someone had mentioned, maybe Karen, about the word, the prominence of the word in either poetry or philosophy. And in both cases, I think the word is still something that both the poet would search for the word that was the right word, and the philosopher would too, would ask for that word to come. So I think in their sort of articulation. So I think there's a similar, the two are the same in that regard.
So we can, I mean, on page 188 is where he talks about philosophy in these terms. He says, what is meant by philosophia is not so much wisdom and knowledge for the sake of knowledge, but rather the never to be quenched desire for knowledge and the unrelenting search for wisdom.
Yes.
And then he says that is not that does not square with what Lessing's famous words, that given the choice, he would prefer the search of truth over the possession of truth. It's neither an occasional idea by Plato, but the fundamental insight into temporality and finitude, which the gods don't share in, which is that of human beings, and which separates them irremediably from the divine, despite all their participation in immortality, which may be granted to them through fame and memory. So this is what he is. This is what he says. What it means for philosophia to be this never to be quenched desire for knowledge and unrelenting search for wisdom
without progress, and there's no progress either.
But it is the always essential need to try to escape our temporality and our finitude. So that would be something that have to be specific to humans, right?
Yeah.
And part of his theory of finitude then is we're not just finite, but we are also always striving to be more than finite. We get this in his talk about religion, where he thinks much of religion is set up based on this basic biological need to think that death isn't the end. And how to explain that. Sorry, there's lots of kids in the neighborhood running around right now, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I agree. There's in one sense, there's no progress in that too. That's fair. And there's no, I don't think, Eric, I don't think any of the Eastern religions had the concept of religion in ancient times. Like there wasn't such a thing as religion and the secular, like
there's right, like Tomoku Masazawa has a great book on the invention of world religion starting basically in the 1800s. Like even Christians in Europe didn't have a notion of religion as we have a notion of religion today.
Yeah. Well, yes, right. Yeah, that's a good passage on philosophy. I like that.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left, which means we need to answer the chat GDP question, GPT question, right? Is this new technology?
Well, I think where was the page where he's talking about discerning true arguments, and that's right, part of this unquenchable desire for knowledge or unrelenting search for wisdom and truth. And that, where does he say? At the top of 187, that it's the love of true arguments. And just now, whenever I read anything on Twitter, if I read anything on blogs, on Facebook, right, in any social media context, even if it's a New York Times article, there's always the suspicion now of, is this ChatGPT generated? Every email I get now, is this ChatGPT generated, right? Even right now with the video screen, it's kind of like how many of these people are actually people and how many are these avatars that are AI generated. right? The bullshit detector is now aggravated because it's got to be constantly in use now in a way that I don't think, which is what I think Socrates and Plato are getting at with writing, that you need to be especially careful with writing, because writing can be, even if Plato's name is signed to it, it doesn't mean that it's Plato's words. Writing, right? Like you have a grocery list that you've written down, somebody else could replace everything that you wrote down, but because you're reliant on your grocery list, you can now you're buying all this stuff that you didn't need. I don't know.
But isn't there a difference between the authorship and the logoi? So we could say, we can still see whether it was written by a computer, or whether it's written, regardless, we can talk about whether the good arguments are there or not, whether good ideas are there or not, whether the good reasons are there or not. And I think that's what's going on here, is he's emphasizing one of the points that Socrates makes in the Theaetetus, that the point is to train people to recognize Socrates' job as a midwife, as opposed to other midwives who just give birth, help women give birth. Socrates' goal is to help people create ideas that are true and wise and have a kind of reality to them rather than just illusions, right? So he has that different sort of discernment going on. He helps them give birth into the true, instead of giving birth to the illusionary. So I think whatever the source, we can still say that's what's important, is that we recognize, oh, that's a good argument, whether it came from ChatGPT or whether it came from an actual human brain.
Well, I just had an insight. Chat GDT or GBT, whatever it is, it's a all of a sudden now everybody can be a sophist. We have a machine that can produce sophistry, but it doesn't change the fact that if you're a philosopher, you're not going to be taken in by it, because you're going to go.
Well, one would hope we wouldn't be taken in by it.
Well, if you're a real philosopher, like he says somewhere, for those who know in here, to those who know. In other words, if you've spent your life doing, working with the real philosophical tradition, and you would know what to look for. And yeah, so I mean, I was just thinking, putting all the works of Derrida into a Chat GBT, I wonder what you'd come up with. Anyway,
I mean, I don't know if you've used it, but I put all my paper assignments in now, and it does better than half my students do. I mean, because it's drawing on databases, and there are good arguments in those databases.
Yeah, but that's if you think philosophy is just arguments, though.
Well, no, it's not doing philosophy. Of course not. It's a computer. It can't do philosophy, but it can produce a philosophy paper.
Yeah.
That's one of the ways students use it, is to get ideas for arguments, even if they don't copy and paste it. They say, oh, that's a good point. I'm going to integrate that in my paper. But I'm trying to see the connection to memory. That was what it originally started, right?
For me, the issue was, if writing weakens our memory rather than helps it, doesn't ChatGPT further the weakening of memory? Because right, like David, you were saying, students can use it to generate an idea for a paper. I've like done lots of conversations with it. That is it weakening my memory by relying on it or not? And then, or the opposite, which is, can ChatGPT remember me after I die, and I don't need humans to remember me because I got ChatGPT to remember me?
Yeah, Greg.
I was going to say, I mean, it seems to me that ChatGPT illustrates, I think, what's legitimate in Plato's worry about writing, and maybe what Gadamer would share in the worries about writing, which is that if you think that memory or understanding or knowledge or whatever can be thought of simply in terms of writing, of having some information written on the mind or whatever, like, lots of contemporary like analytic theories of mind think. Sorry, my computer just beeped at me. It's about to die. That is a mistake, right? I mean, in one sense, ChatGPT knows everything because it's got the whole internet at its disposal. But in another very real sense, it doesn't know anything, right? Because it doesn't know what any of those sentences that it has access to actually mean. And so if you had this thought that, oh, hey, look, we have this thing writing now, which can do all the stuff that memory did, only way better because it doesn't, wear away or degrade. I think if you had that thought, I think both Plato and Gadamer would agree that that's a mistake. That understanding is not simply having some information stored or encoded somewhere. It's having that plus the ability to like make sense out of it, which ChatGPT can't do.
Plus the ability to bring it to life in insightful sorts of ways.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, it's 4 o'clock, so I think that's going to be our last word, Greg.
Oh dear. Okay, well.
You don't need to plug your computer in after all.
Yeah.
Around your house.
So sorry. Yeah.
Okay,
left
I want
the
to
plug
thank
in the
everyone
dining
coming. Nancy put information on the chat about the upcoming conference in Calgary. Actually, there's 2 upcoming conferences in Calgary, but one comes up in 10 days and one comes up in a few months. But this is the Canadian Hermeneutic Institute. And that's on there. And also the call for papers. I put a link for that for NASP, which will also be in Calgary in September. So I encourage you all to look to those. And we will meet again in July, May, June, July, mid-July. So I'll send an email out and request suggestions for things to read and discuss. And I hope you all can make it back then. All right, thanks for coming. Bye-bye.
And give a thought to Dawn.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. I might need to drive myself to the hospital and see how he's doing.
Okay,
Yeah, definitely do that.
good. Bye-bye.